Hello, I'd like to talk about Johann Sebastian Bach and his cantata Gottes Zeit ist die allerbeste Zeit. I've been doing modern and contemporary music analysis in my YouTube channel so far, and I want to have a look at this piece by Bach, because he is a composer who shows you just how incredibly ambitious it is possible to be, and he shows you what you can achieve through the medium of music. And I think that it's worth having a look at a piece like this just as a reminder of that, because in a sense I think we have sort of lowered expectations for music today in terms of what it can give to our lives and what it can contribute on a societal level. And Bach gives you an amazing example of a composer who is sort of throwing everything into his work. He's got a very sophisticated knowledge of philosophy, of theology, of musical science, obviously, but also of just practical suggestions in terms of how you can live your life and how you can be a better person. And he weaves all of that into music of extraordinary power. So I want to have a look at this particular cantata by Bach. It's a very early work, and in some ways it's not particularly typical of his output, but it is an absolutely magnificent piece, and it has exerted a fascination over composers for centuries now. And in fact, to give a very recent example, there's a Hungarian composer who's now over 90 years old, György Kurtág, who has been performing arrangements taken from this cantata, Actus Tragicus, together with his wife in concert performances. He's been doing this for years now, and every time they do this, the piece just casts an extraordinary spell over audiences. So it's a magnificent work, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by having a sort of global look at what the cantata genre is, and then having a look at this specific work. And I'll finish with a detailed musical analysis of certain aspects of the piece. So to begin with, we should define what a cantata is. Now that's not an easy thing to do because there is no hard and fast rule as to what constitutes a cantata per se, but one thing I can say is that the term cantata derives from the Italian word cantare, which means to sing. On one level, the word cantata simply means a sung piece. However, what it specifically means in the context of the early Baroque usually is a vocal piece with instruments that's written in multiple movements. Now, there are exceptions to that. There are cantatas written in only one movement. They're relatively rare. For the most part, you have a series of contrasting movements written in different styles and written according to different genres as well. Bach wrote both sacred and secular cantatas, so there are a few examples of secular cantatas, such as, for example, the famous so-called coffee cantata, which is basically a comedic one-act opera scene, essentially. But the vast majority of his output in the cantata genre is sacred and was intended for specifically liturgical use during a church service. The church cantata is essentially a mix of all sorts of different forms and genres, and it's by no means a pure form. It's been described as a bastard form, it's been described as sort of a cobbled together grab bag of all sorts of different things, and it's just interesting to have a look at how disparate it in fact is. So in a typical Bach cantata, you will have recitatives, arias, chorales, choruses, fugues, all sorts of things. And all of these different elements stem from different musical traditions. So for example, the recitative and the aria stem from the opera. And in opera, a recitative is usually a fairly short movement for a solo voice accompanied by some sort of very spare instrumental accompaniment such as a harpsichord or an organ. And its purpose is simply to deliver information, to sort of bring the story a little bit farther along. The aria, of course, is a sung piece with an instrumental accompaniment, and you can have solos, duos, or even occasionally trios in arias in Bach cantatas. Next you have chorales. And chorales are essentially Bach taking a hymn melody, often composed by Martin Luther, and harmonizing it in 4 parts: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. So the basis of a chorale is you take a familiar melody and you harmonize it. And you have essentially a homorhythmic texture, which is to say that all 4 voices, generally speaking, are singing the same rhythm. Choruses are a whole other thing, and Bach's cantatas, especially the ones from his Leipzig years, usually start off with a very, very complex choral movement in which you have a chorus, you have solo voices, you have very, very complex contrapuntal instrumental texture accompanying it, and usually this is the most complex movement of a Bach cantata. And then finally, you also have fugues occasionally in the vocal writing or in the instrumental writing. So really the cantata brings in all sorts of very diverse forms of musical expression, some of them associated more with staged music, with theatrical music, some of them stemming from purely vocal traditions such as the madrigal or the motet, and it brings them together in the unified framework of a church service. Now in Bach, the cantata is an aesthetic object, it is an artistic product, but it's also something absolutely pragmatic. And one of the interesting things about these cantatas is that they are seeking, generally speaking, to allow the person who's listening to them to receive some kind of moral instruction. They are basically lessons in how to live your life and how to be a better person. But of course, they're delivered in a sublimely beautiful way, so you're not necessarily simply being lectured to. There's a very strong aesthetic dimension to it, which presumably allows the message to come through all the more strongly. So typically what Bach does is he will start off by presenting a problem of some kind, a difficult choice that you're going to have to face in your life, a difficult period that you're going to have to come to terms with. And then he will show you a vision of utopia, of heaven, of the way things could be, and something to aspire to as a human being, something that you could orient your life towards by consistently making good choices. And then finally, he will also show you how you can make good choices, not just in some heavenly utopian realm, but in the here and now on earth. And so the Bach cantatas explore this constant duality, this constant dichotomy between the sort of grubby, imperfect, difficult, painful reality of earthly existence, and then this perfect, idealized, utopian heaven that we can aspire to as human beings. Bach had an extraordinary project with his cantatas. He formulated the project very early on in his career of writing a separate cantata for every Sunday and every holiday of the liturgical calendar, which is an amazing undertaking in and of itself. I mean, it actually boggles the mind how one composer could have been so productive and written music of such extraordinarily high quality at such an intense pace of composition. So when Bach first moved to Leipzig to take up his position at the St. Thomas School, he was in charge of composing a new cantata every single week. So just to put that in perspective, that means writing between 20 and 30 minutes of original music every week, and rehearsing it, and performing it, and being in charge of teaching the performers who are going to be presenting the music, finding the instruments that he's going to need, because he often required rather esoteric instruments for his cantatas. And then that, in addition to everything else he had going on in his life, he was a very popular figure. He had a lot of visitors. He had 17 kids. He had a whole home life, a whole family life to deal with as well. So just the sheer concentration and the sheer volume of output that it took to realize this ambition it stretches your imagination to the breaking point, quite frankly. And then the other thing is, okay, so it's one thing to imagine writing a cycle of cantatas, so 60 cantatas, right, for every Sunday and every holiday of the year. Bach did it 3 times, and he did it in a very short span of time. So basically the bulk of his cantata production took place in the early 1720s. So again, it's an absolutely amazing accomplishment on every level. Finally, his cantatas typically draw upon very simple, humble, familiar things such as hymns, very familiar melodies that everyone at the time would have known. And he takes these hymns and draws them into these extraordinarily complex and rich polyphonic contrapuntal webs in his cantatas. It's absolutely amazing how he takes such humble materials and elevates them to the absolute highest level of art. And just a quick word on the texts. We're going to have a look at the text of this particular cantata in a minute, but basically these texts were written for the most part by anonymous librettists. We don't always know who compiled the texts, and they are drawn up from all sorts of different sources. So you have verses from the Bible, you have hymns, you have sometimes just very low-quality poetry that's sort of mixed in with all of the rest of it. And very often they are organized around a central theme, but sort of taking a few lines here, a few lines there. So they're really stitched together from a lot of different sources. So just to give a bit of context, this particular piece was written probably in 1707 or 1708, while Bach was living in Mühlhausen, which is a small city in the Thuringia region of what is now Germany. And this region, by the way, lies in the absolute geographic center of the country. And that is pretty much where Bach spent his entire career, not in Mühlhausen, but in that region. This is a cantata that he wrote when he was 22 years old. And so we'll add that to the already unfathomable level of accomplishment of the composer. This is a piece that he wrote at the outset of his career, so bear that in mind as well. It's a funeral cantata, so it was written to accompany a funereal service, and we don't know the precise occasion, but there are very good indications that it was either a cantata written for the death of his uncle in 1707, or written for the death of the mayor of Mühlhausen in 1708. This piece is marked by very austere scoring. It's written for a very small ensemble, atypically of Bach's cantatas, generally speaking. There are only 2 recorders, 2 viola da gambas, and then there is a vocal quartet and a continuo part. So the continuo is simply some sort of harmonic instrument, such as an organ or a harpsichord, usually played together with a bass instrument. This ensemble has a rather muted, rather dark coloration to it, generally speaking. It is one of the things I think that makes it such a striking work. It was strongly influenced by the work of Dietrich Buxtehude. Now, Buxtehude was a German composer-organist who Bach was very familiar with and indeed admired a great deal. And he aspired to belong to that great lineage of German organist composers. And Buxtehude was an example of that tradition who was living. He was a very old man by the time Bach encountered his work. And in fact, there's a story that Bach, at one point, traveled from Arnstadt all the way up to Lübeck, which is a distance of about 500 kilometers, just in order to hear Buxtehude perform. And to do that in the early 1700s was not a trivial undertaking. And in fact, the story goes that he traveled this distance on foot. That may very well be apocryphal, but if in fact he did that, it shows you something of the depth of his obsession and his commitment. So this is the first in a very extended series of cantatas. He would go on to write over 200 of them. Unfortunately, about 2/5 of the cantata repertoire that he created has been lost due to his estate being broken up after his death. But nevertheless, we do have approximately 209 surviving cantatas. So let's just have a quick look at how this piece is structured. Overall, it falls into 2 halves, essentially. You have an opening sonatina, which is an instrumental movement, absolutely beautiful, one of the most beautiful things I think Bach ever wrote. And the remarkable thing about this, in terms of instrumental sonority, is he takes these 2 recorders and has them playing basically the same thing in the unison, but occasionally the 2 parts slightly go out of phase with each other, and you have these beautifully overlapping minor seconds, and the effect of it is absolutely magical. So before we go any further, I'd like to just have us listen to the opening sonatina. It's a very short movement. It's just about 2 minutes long. So after the sonatina, we have a first vocal movement. And this vocal movement is written in 4 large sections. So I've grouped this under the heading stern warnings, because in this vocal movement we have basically a series of very grave and somber pronunciations on the fact of the inevitability of death. So we have, to start with, a chorus called Gottes Zeit ist die allerbeste Zeit, which simply means God's time is the very best time. Next we have Ach Herr, lehre uns bedenken, which goes on to say, Lord, teach us to know that we will die. So this is essentially a series of memento moris, just to remember that you are mortal and that you will die. Next we have bestellen dein Haus, so get your house in order because you are going to die and you don't want to leave a messy estate. Finally, we have Es ist der alte Bund, so it is the ancient law, man, you must die. I think we can safely say that it is not exactly a knee slapper. So by this point, we've got this sort of succession of very weighty, tragic messages, and something very interesting happens. A soprano enters in and gives us the message that we want the Lord to come, and then things start to get very, very different from an expressive point of view. In the second vocal movement, we have visions of peace and redemption. So we have basically 2 different opposing views of death in this piece. We have one that is very Old Testament, it's very stern, and the second part is more focused on redemption, on rebirth, on peace, on heavenly visions. So the idea is you start with a kind of warning, a kind of attention-getting, stern sort of pronunciation on the inevitability of death, and then we end with something much more hopeful and much more positive sounding. So in the second vocal movement, we have basically two sections. So the first one is In deine Hände befehl ich meinen Geist. So into thine hands I commit my spirit. And then we have Heute wirst du mit mir im Paradies sein. So today you will be with me in paradise. So a very different sort of take on the death message of this piece. Finally, we end with a choral movement, Gloria, Lob, und Herrlichkeit. So that's basically offering praise to God. So we've established that in the first part of the piece, the first half, we have this very stern and somewhat unpleasant message that death is inevitable and you are going to perish. And what happens is that the lower voices in the end of the first vocal movement are sort of intoning these pronouncements very severely. And then we have a soprano voice that sort of comes out of nowhere and presents a very different sort of imploring message. Yes, come, Lord. And then we have this text. We hear it again and again and again. Ja, komm, Herr Jesu. And so what's very interesting is that this soprano becomes a more and more prominent part of the texture until at the end of the movement, it's all that's left. And there's this very brief span, it's maybe 2 or 3 seconds long, of this sort of melismatic flourish in the soprano voice. And all the other instruments drop away, and that's how the movement ends. So it ends in a very inconclusive manner. And it's a remarkable thing. And it allows Bach to create a bridge between this sort of Old Testament world and then the New Testament world that we begin to explore in the second half. So let's have a look at the text. Now, conveniently, it's not very long, so it's possible to sort of read the whole thing. And basically, in keeping with Bach's composition of cantatas in general, we have a lot of different sources being pulled in to put this text together. So we have verses from the Old and New Testaments, we have extracts from hymns by Martin Luther and Adam Reisner, and we even have the occasional line whose attribution is not certain. So let's have a look at this. We start out with, God's time is the very best time. In him we live, move, and exist so long as he wills. In him shall we die at the right time, when he wills. Right, so we have a meditation on the inscrutable nature of God and of the way he decides when and how and so on we will die, and the fact that we do not have access to this knowledge, but we have to have faith in the wisdom of God. So next we have, Ah, Lord, teach us to remember that our death is certain, so that we may become wise. Put thine house in order, for thou shalt perish and not continue living. It is the ancient law. Man, thou must perish. So we're starting to get the message. It's pretty clear. You're going to die. And that's just how it is. And then that is the point at which, again, the soprano comes in and says, Yes, come, Lord Jesus. So in the second vocal movement, we have, Into thine hands I commit my spirit, for you have redeemed me, Lord, thou my faithful God. Today you will be with me in paradise. In peace and joy do I depart, as God doth will it. Consoled am I in heart and mind, calm and quiet. As God gave me his promise, death has become my slumber. So again, a very strong, marked contrast between the first half and the second. And then we end with this verse from a hymn by Adam Reisner, a 17th century composer of hymns. Glory, praise, honor, and majesty to thee, God, Father, and Son, be given, the Holy Ghost with these names. May godly strength make us triumph through Jesus Christ, Lord. Amen. Bach's cantatas have an extraordinary depth to them, both in terms of their meaning and in terms of their expressive intensity. And one of the ways that he does this, one of the ways that he makes the music so powerful, is that he's constantly pulling in all sorts of allusions to things that are not specifically musical in the musical parts. So, for example, he will take an aspect of the text, it could be an image or it could be a single word, and he will illustrate it explicitly in the music. And beyond that, he also uses all sorts of rhetorical figures in the music that have a very specific function. So, for example, a sort of proximity to good things, to heavenly things, will be expressed a certain way in the music, and a proximity to the sort of foul, compromised earth will be expressed in a very different way. And sometimes it's extremely simple and very obvious. But that being said, if you are not sort of in 1707 and you are not a fluent speaker of German, it's very easy to miss these things. So let's just have a look at a few very simple examples of how Bach treats musical figuralism in this cantata. So the first example is the text So lange will. So that's from the very first opening part of the first vocal movement of the piece. And that just means so long as he wills. And so on the word lange, long, we have a very long, extended held note. So that's a very, very simple example of how this works. Let's just have a listen to that. So next we have In ihm leben, weben und sind wir. In him we live,
weave,
and exist. And here's an interesting thing. He takes the word weben, so
weave,
and he accompanies it with a much more quickly moving rhythmic figure in the vocal part. So if we look at In ihm leben here, we see that it's written in relatively lengthy note values, so quarter notes and eighth notes. And then when we move to weben, we have this very rapidly moving figure, and so on and so forth. So it's a very rapid, ornamented figure, which simply is a figuralism for the sort of moving, twitching, alive human figure. Finally, let's have a look at this next line here, und nicht lebendig bleiben, and not remain living. So it's similar to the previous line in the sense that when Bach hits upon the word lebendig, so living, remain living, we get this sudden melismatic flourish in the vocal part. And again, it's just a metaphor for life as opposed to death. And the words referring to death in this piece, generally speaking, are often imparted in this rather austere, severe, rhythmically very simple manner. And then when we have an allusion to life, suddenly we get these much more animated vocal figures. And in this particular part of the work, each time this word returns, it's in a somewhat more ornamented and lengthier, more drawn out sort of form of expression. So let's have a listen to that. Bach is essentially a very economical composer. He doesn't like to waste material. He's like a good carpenter. He can take sort of any piece of wood and find out what is the absolute optimal way to use it to best advantage. And so he will take often these very, very simple rhythmic motifs, things that just appear completely banal and uninteresting, and he'll spin them off in hundreds and hundreds of different ways. He'll have them backwards and forwards and upside down, and you'll have them moving at different speeds simultaneously. And you don't even necessarily consciously notice this happening when you're listening to the piece. But nevertheless, it provides a kind of unconscious unity to everything that you hear. And that's particularly interesting in this work because unlike some of the later Bach cantatas, the ones from the Leipzig years, this piece has very sudden and rapid shifts of character and atmosphere. We have this constant sort of moving between different tempi, between different types of expression, between different time signatures. And he unifies all of this by the use of a characteristic rhythmic motif that is present in every single movement of the work. So it's very simple, again, and it's not going to command your conscious attention, but once you start to become sensitized to the fact that it is absolutely everywhere in the work, you start to realize just how subtle Bach's musical construction actually is. So the figure itself is the essence of simplicity. It's just an eighth note and two 16th notes. So bum, ba ba bum, ba ba bum, ba ba bum, ba ba, and so on. And coincidentally, you get this exact same rhythmic motif in the slow movement of Beethoven's 7th Symphony, which is also a funereal dirge. So there seems to be some kind of connection with that kind of musical figure and this kind of funeral music. But it's an interesting thing. I don't think this is a purely sort of neutral choice on Bach's behalf. I think that he has chosen this because it imparts a kind of gentle, lilting, rhythmic continuity. It's a very sort of light dance kind of figure that I think prevents the music from becoming overly weighty given the subject matter. So let's have a look at how this is transformed and present throughout the different movements of the piece. So we hear it at the very outset of the work. We're just going to have a quick listen to that again so you can get a sense of just how prevalent this rhythmic motif is throughout the piece. You hear it in the opening seconds of the work in the viola da gamba parts, bum, ba, ba, bum, ba, 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 and then it is immediately taken up by the recorders just afterwards. So let's have a listen to that. So next we find the figure in the first vocal movement in section 2C of the work. And you can see it again right here in the recorder parts. That's just in the sort of right-hand side of the screen here where it's marked lento. So we have the same figure again, ba-ba-bum, ba-ba-bum. So I spent some time looking at the soprano interjection at the end of the first vocal movement, and it's worth pointing out that at this key dramatic moment, this key textual moment in the work as well, where suddenly the expression changes so dramatically, that characteristic rhythmic figure appears again. So on the words ya, 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 come, ya, 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 and so on, we have the rhythmic figure that recalls certainly the opening movement of the piece and also earlier sections of the first vocal section of the work. Finally, the motif appears in the last movement at the very outset in the recorder parts. that's just a few of many examples of Bach's use of very, very simple rhythmic motifs in a way that creates an extraordinary sense of unity on a very fundamental and unconscious level when you're listening to the music. So this is an amazing piece. I would strongly recommend that you listen to the whole thing from start to finish. It's not particularly long, about 20 minutes, and it's, I think, one of his most beautiful works. And you can also find a wealth of information and documentation on Bach's cantatas in general on the internet. There's an amazing website called Bach-cantatas.com where you will find all the texts and all the scores of every cantata he ever wrote, as well as commentary and all sorts of things. It's an amazing website. You can also go on YouTube and you'll find some amazing recordings of all of these pieces. There's going to be a link in the description of this video at the bottom so you can have a look at a very beautiful performance of the entire cantata.